Hello everyone out there. My name is Sam Moylan from Kansas State University, and this presentation will cover a research paper I recently wrote on the security of inter-vehicle networks. This presentation is only going to glance over this paper. It's not going to give any concrete details whatsoever due to time constraints, but I encourage you to please read the paper. I'll link it in the description. Let's get started. So just a brief outline of this presentation. I'll first answer why I chose to do this topic, then I'll give an introduction to the CAN, then I will discuss electronic control units. Next, I will discuss existing work and its impact, and finally I'll give a little wrap up. So let's get started. Why did I choose this topic? For one, it's not a prominent subject within the security field. I know when I think of cybersecurity, the first thing that comes to mind is not vehicle security. In fact, it didn't really come to mind at all until I started working on this project. Also, it has a huge impact on daily life. Everyone owns or operates a vehicle, almost everyone, so our lives are in jeopardy every time we do that. And these vulnerabilities I'm going to discuss here, the security risks only make that risk larger. And finally, just curiosity. It's a cool subject. That's that. So here's the research questions I aim to answer. What can an attacker make a vehicle do? Are remote attacks possible? What kind of vehicles are vulnerable to attacks? And is it possible to crash a vehicle? So let's get on to the introduction to the controller area network, also known as CAN. So this is the most prominent of the inter-vehicle networks. It's not the only one, but for the purpose of this research, it is. It connects many nodes along the CAN bus. It has a very well documented protocol in which anyone can look it up on the internet, and there's plenty of research papers to kind of synthesize the information. It's broadcast in nature, which means that each message is sent to every node on the bus, and there was no target address or return address or anything of that nature. It's sent to everyone, and they interpret it on a need-to-know basis. If the message is intended for them, they will know based on the ID. So a CAN frame has an identifier field. It's 11 bits. It can be 29 bits depending on if it's an extended identifier. I'll discuss that in a second. It contains a data length code, a data field, and a cyclic redundancy check field. These are just four kind of prominent fields within the frame. Here's an actual look at a frame. So as you can see here, we have the identifier. It's typically 11 bits, but if this ID extension bit is set, it can be an added 18 bits. I encourage you to pause this and just take a look at this frame. The main important field is the ID field and the data field. The data field contains the actual data being sent. Other than that, it's basically irrelevant for the purposes of this presentation. So a little bit more info. When multiple nodes send a message over the bus simultaneously, the one with the lowest ID wins. That is determined through an arbitration phase that is discussed in my paper. The error handling is also discussed in the paper. It involves the things listed here. They're not too important for the research, let alone this presentation, but nevertheless they're discussed in the paper as well. So the CAN connects electronic control units. These ECUs are essentially the brains of the car. They are connected to various sensors and actuators that control mechanical processes. They interact with each other, accepting requests from other ECUs, requesting other ECUs to take action, etc. They control the processes of the car. And a modern vehicle can contain up to 150 of these. Typically, it's somewhere in the range of 30 to 80 from what I've seen. Here's just a brief picture that'll give you kind of a overview of possible ECUs on a modern vehicle. Granted, this is just possibilities and examples. These are not actual ECUs, and they're not specific to any one vehicle. However, if you look at this table right here, I encourage you to pause it and check them out. This shows an example, a concrete example for a 2014 Jeep Cherokee. You can see the high-speed bus and the low-speed bus. The high speed is simply for critical modules, and low speed is for less critical modules. Let's take a look at some existing work. So these three papers listed here are kind of the holy grail of vehicle security research, and I'll get into them a little bit here in the next slide. But I would definitely encourage anyone watching this to check out all 3 of these papers. They're good reads. So the first paper kind of identifies attack surfaces. It identifies them on 3 sections: the indirect physical access, short-range wireless access, and long-range wireless access. I will not talk about the indirect physical access in this presentation. It's discussed in the paper, but it is not too important for the purposes of this research. The research primarily focused on remote access, which is wireless access. So short-range wireless access can take place through Bluetooth. That can be, the paper mentions a vulnerability in the Bluetooth protocol that allows for a buffer overflow attack when certain circumstances are met when pairing an unpaired device, and this can also work with a paired device, but the unpaired is the one we actually look for from an attacker's perspective. It's pretty fascinating how they get it to work. It's documented in my paper as well as the Checkaway paper listed on the previous slide, so I'd encourage anyone to check that out. Long-range wireless access is usually through the telematics module, which typically has cellular network capabilities for GPS and things of that nature. So through a vulnerability in the cellular network protocol on a particular telematics module, some attackers were able to, well, some researchers were able to gain access to the telematics module, and in turn gain access to the interior CAN network. Same goes with Bluetooth. Once you gain access to the module, you kind of have access to the interior network, and that is the whole point of the attacks. And these are documented in my paper. So after gaining access to the modules, the question comes, what can you actually make the vehicle do once you have that? And these could be something small, such as altering the display or controlling the volume, or it can have an actual large and dangerous impact, such as influencing the braking or the steering or even the acceleration. And obviously, an attacker would want to go for something with a large impact and potentially hazardous to a driver. Real quick, actually, and the paper written by Miller and Valasek, the first, it kind of goes through and tells you what all you can do if you're able to gain access to one of these modules and inject CAN packets, and what kind of behaviors you can make the vehicle perform. And it's pretty interesting. They have essentially almost complete control of the vehicle. Granted, they have physical access directly through the onboard diagnostics port, but I'll get into why that is not so important right now. So then, that second paper written by those same guys, Miller and Valasek, they're able to kind of connect the dots. They're able to take the remote exploits by Checkaway and company, combine those with their actual physical functional control of the vehicle they were shown in their first paper, merge those two together and show how they can actually control a vehicle through remote attacks. And that's pretty fascinating. I would encourage anyone to read that paper, because they're able to actually control a little bit of the steering of the vehicle through the lane keep assist functionality, and that's pretty cool. That's pretty insane. So the next question comes: what are some mitigation techniques? We have these attack surfaces. What are ways we can mitigate these attacks? So one of which is CAN packet frequency checks. CAN packets are typically broadcasted over the bus at a pretty normal frequency that can be observed in typical car behavior. If you were to, say, sniff the CAN traffic over the course of a day on a vehicle, you would get a certain frequency for each packets, and comparing that frequency with injected packet frequency from an attacker could kind of show a discrepancy in which you would be alerted that something fishy was going on. And another mitigation technique that's probably a lot more interesting was documented in this paper titled Identifying ECUs Based on Inimitable Characteristics of Signals in the CAN. This is discussed in my paper as well, and it essentially adds an identifier to each ECU. As I said earlier, messages don't have an identifier field. However, they generate a certain digital or analog signal when they're broadcast over the bus, and this signal is unique to each ECU. So analyzing that signal tells you where the message came from, and analyzing the message tells you where it should have come from. If there's a discrepancy in those two things, you know you have possibly some kind of malicious attack going on, in which case you'd want to ignore those packets. It should be said, though, that neither of these have been implemented. They have both been proposed in research papers, and that is the extent of them. So, take a brief look at the impact that this research has had on the automotive industry. So the findings from the remote exploitation paper by Miller and Valasek actually resulted in 1.4 million vehicles being recalled. And that's pretty insane impact, if you ask me. And then next we can also look at these two pie charts. And if you look at the one from 2016 on the right, you see that there are 22% of the vulnerabilities detected have an overall safety rating of critical, which is the worst and most potentially dangerous. Right? Now fast forward to 2018, and that same section is down to 6%. This shows you that automotive manufacturers have noticed the research and they have made strides in mitigating these vulnerabilities and making their vehicles safer. Granted, the safety high concerns have gone up, but the one that people are mainly concerned about, and that rightly so, is the critical section. So let's quickly revisit those research questions mentioned at the beginning. See if we were able to answer them in this research. So, what can an attacker make a vehicle do? What can an attacker make a vehicle do? Theoretically, a lot. A lot of the stuff in the paper is theoretical. They only were able to modify the steering after combining it with the remote exploits. In the previous paper, they were able to do a lot of things, but like I said, that was through direct physical access, which isn't totally realistic. However, they did not even attempt to do these other functionalities when they exploited it remotely. The purpose of the paper was to show that it was remotely exploitable, so they only ended up doing one of the attacks that they mentioned. The others are possible. I don't know. I don't have a vehicle to test it on myself. Are remote attacks possible? Yes, without a doubt. What kind of vehicles are vulnerable to the attacks? I was under the impression it might just be more luxury vehicles that have a lot more features, but after doing the research, I have seen that it's actually just any modern vehicle. Most modern vehicles from 2008 have a telematics module with cellular capabilities, roughly in that time frame, and so that's an attack surface. Is it possible to crash a vehicle? It's up in the air. So, in conclusion, vehicle safety does not exist without vehicle security. This is an interesting statement, and it's very true, and is also very frightening, because it's impossible to have complete security. You never know what kind of vulnerabilities are going to come up, what kind of clever attacker is going to think of something new in order to gain access to your vehicle. You never know. And this is also made more pressing given the entrance of completely autonomous vehicles here pretty soon, and those will be the norm, and those will without a doubt have network capabilities, maybe even some kind of vehicle-to-vehicle communication mechanism to negotiate intersection behavior, stuff like that. This just increases the size of the attack surface and opens up more possibility for attacks. So pretty scary stuff, pretty interesting stuff. I'd like to see where it's headed. Again, I encourage you to please check out the research paper as it goes into all of this stuff in much greater detail. And thanks for watching.